That look good?
You can actually go back to the title slide.
Ah, sorry.
Thanks, though. All right, I think we can get things going. So, good morning and welcome to everyone joining us. You are in the 2022-23 Integrated Resource Planning Inputs and Assumptions Modeling Advisory Group webinar. My name is Nathan Barsick, Supervisor for the IRP section in CPUC's Energy Division. We want to give you a couple notes about logistics and scope. This might seem familiar to a few of you, but on slide 3, let's cover some basics. So slides, as Paul Clackwood just asked in the Q&A, are not available yet on the site, but they should be available soon. And next slide, please, David. Some of you may heard or have heard the audio recording has been flipped on, so this webinar is being recorded. There's 4 main purposes or objectives of what we're trying to accomplish this morning. First is to provide all of you an update on the schedule for the inputs and assumptions for this cycle of IRP. Second is to provide an overview of some of the specific proposed inputs and assumptions updates that are on the table. Third is to give stakeholders an opportunity to ask clarifying questions. And fourth is to request informal feedback from stakeholders and give them a little bit of direction on how to do so. On the next slide, there will be some housekeeping for us to cover that may also be familiar. The main thing here is Q&A. So this is going to be a fairly technical workshop or webinar. We're going to jump around from one topic to another quite quickly as well. We're going to lean towards written Q&A because of the sort of the nature of the content that we're covering here. What I'll ask is kind of my usual caveat of please keep your questions to clarifying questions. Try to limit the amount of kind of assertions and statements of party positions that you might be tempted to put in the Q&A. We understand desire to do so, but the real point today is to make sure that everyone understands what we're trying to do on these specific topics. We'll ask that you default to using the Q&A function that's in the lower right part of the screen. There should be 3 horizontal dots in the very lower right. If you touch that button, there should be a drop-down menu with one of the options as Q&A. Please use that as your default option for inputting questions that we will get to at regular junctures and actually mid-stream on some of the slides, time allowing. If time allows, we might be able to get in some verbal questions. I know that some folks do prefer that from time to time. If we get to those junctures, we'll make it clear. And you can use either the WebEx raise hand function or *3 if you're on the phone to do so. But again, please default to using the Q&A function in the lower right. No matter which way you put in a question, please do remember to identify yourself before asking the question. And as usual, should we not be able to answer your question in the time allotted, or if one just comes up later, please email us at the IRP data request email address on this slide. We'll seek to post a Q&A transcript to the website as well as a recording soon after the webinar. And some instructions for providing informal written comments to staff are coming in a few slides. There's an emphasis, though, on informal, which marks a bit of a change from the last 2 IRP cycles of us doing this, where traditionally inputs and assumptions documents were adopted at proceeding level and after a lot of process. So multiple modeling advisory groups, sometimes burrowing in on the individual topics that you might see here in deep detail that eventually led into a ruling and an adoption at proceeding level. We're shifting things a little bit process-wise this cycle for a couple main reasons. First is that the inputs and assumptions at this point are just more mature. And they might not require as much vetting as they did 5-6 years ago when we were originally developing all of these pieces of information in concert with stakeholders. Second is that there's a lot going on in IRP. We have various tracks now, lots of work about all different parts of the planning horizon that we're supposed to look at. And we need to be able to find process efficiencies where we can and wherever reasonable. Nonetheless, we do take the exercise very seriously, and we're hoping for great feedback from you guys today and later so that we can get on good common ground about what the most appropriate inputs and assumptions are for modeling this cycle. On the next slide, you'll see a whole host of topics and a whole host of presenters for this morning. So quickly from Energy Division, you've already met me. We'll also have Donald Brooks, supervisor of the Energy Resource Modeling team, Ali Ashraghi, Neil Raffin from the IRP team, and then contributing in the Q&A will be James McGarry from the IRP team, Jared Ferguson, Lauren Reiser, all from the IRP team, and Josh Honeycutt from the Transport Electrification team, with David Withrow coordinating. From our consultancy 3, we have presenters Femi Sawyer, Jimmy Nelson, Mengyao Yuan, John Stevens, Charlie Duff, Mike Sontag, Suman Wang, and Sam Schreiber. And contributing to the Q&A, we'd have Arnie Olson, Krista Heavey, and Emily Peterson. At a high level, the topics that we're going to cover fall into kind of 2 buckets, in my view. First is a set of them that you're kind of used to in IRP, INA conversations: resource cost updates, resource potential and land use constraints, shed demand response, shift demand response, generation profiles, transmission constraint implementation, fuel price updates, those sorts of things. The second might be a little bit more new and a little bit more blue sky. And that list includes updates to reflect the recent Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level, emerging zero carbon technologies, vehicle to grid integration analysis, hybrid and paired solar plus storage modeling, annual build out limits for resource types and first available online year for them, as well as reliability modeling improvements for Resolve and Servum that might be familiar from MAGS earlier this year. With that, I think I will pass things over to Ali Ashraghi for a little bit more context.
Thank you, Nathan. And good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ali Ashraghi, analyst IRP and the IRP lead for developing the inputs and assumptions, aka INA, for this IRP cycle. In this section, we just want to give a brief update about the inputs and assumptions development process and the timing. Next slide. So the INA document is a reference document that we use for IRP modeling within a given cycle. So last IRP cycle, we developed that in 2019. So this document basically describes key data elements, assumptions, and methodologies, including load forecast, baseline resources, candidate resources, resource costs and potentials, operating assumptions, policy constraints, etc. So basically, it's a reference book in IRP for all the modeling and portfolio development that we do it in a given cycle. So we plan to have this document, the 2022 INA, ready to be used for developing the 2023 Preferred System Plan, PSP, for this cycle, as well as the associated transmission planning process portfolios, TPP, 2024-2025 TPP portfolios that will be developed as the same time, basically the same, associated with PSP. I just note that, as you know, there are more near-term use cases that we need to make limited INA updates for them before we finish the whole process that we are going through right now. The first one was the final requirement assumptions. Staff made limited INA updates for the modeling needed to develop final requirements. The other near-term use case that we need to make limited INA updates is for developing the 2023-2024 TPP portfolios. An overview of these updates will be provided as part of the TPP portfolio development process. But as I said here, we are focusing on the INA document that will be used for developing this cycle's preferred system plan. Another note, as many of you know, we use both Resolve and Servum in IRP modeling. So Resolve for capacity expansion modeling and Servum to conduct production cost modeling. The INA document basically covers both. However, there are some specific Servum databases and assumptions that are available on the CPUC website, and the link and description will be included in the INA document. With that said, let's go to the next slide, and I pass it to Don for several updates.
Hello, my name is Donald Brooks. I'm in Energy Division at the Public Utilities Commission. The inputs and assumptions documents describes, yeah, could you go back another slide? One more slide. Yeah, that one's there. Servo updates were also performed for further reliability modeling, added 2018 to 2020 weather years to the existing 1998 to 2017 weather data set. Those updates included new electric demand, wind and solar generation shapes. We also included hydroelectric projections for 18, 19, and 20, those weather years. So all the weather correlated data, the demand and supply side stuff. Staff performed significant baseline reconcile work. That's capitalized because it's kind of the term, what we call it. And it's to update the existing baseline, and I guess that's a modeling baseline with new resources that come online. And we get that by looking at the ISO master generating capability list, that public list that's posted inside the OASIS database on the ISO website there. New anchor data set generating list, the 20, yeah, I'll have to confirm whether it's the 2030 or the 2032 ADS case. August 1 LSE IRP plans. LSE's filed IRP plans on August 1st, 2022, and included some additional in-development resources to go along with the resources that were already in the baseline or in development, some of which have come online since the last time we looked at LSE IRP plans. We updated the existing resources with updated things like CapMax resource IDs. If they come online, we give them their ID instead of the generic name we made for them, and in-service dates, and some other small things. Some thermal generators added a couple megawatts here and there in terms of their PMAX. We also did, updated for that. Staff are performing loss of load modeling alongside the IRP reliability planning process, as Ali just described, and the data is posted to the PUC website right there. Unified RA and IRP modeling data sets 2022 right there. There's a number of other updates that I think we've talked about in previous mags, and there's a slide to talk about some of those more weedsy stuff later in the slide deck, but these are the big things that we're doing, big things we're performing for Servo. Thanks.
Thank you, Donald. So moving on to the next slide. So in terms of the process and timing for developing the 2022 INA document, we expect to finalize this document by the end of this year. In the timeline here, you see this webinar as the first item. So basically, this webinar is the first step in our stakeholders process for INA development. But this is not the start of the work. So we've been working on this behind the scenes for several months now, and we are excited to have this opportunity to present what we have prepared so far and engage with the stakeholders and seek your feedback. As Nathan pointed out, in this webinar, we cover some specific IRP inputs and assumptions documents, topics, and invite stakeholders' informal comments to be submitted to staff by October 6. We incorporate your inputs into the draft INA document to be released in November. Around the same time, we will hold another webinar introducing the draft INA document and some specific topics that are not fully covered in this webinar today. After that, the stakeholders will have 2 weeks to submit their informal comments to staff. And as I said earlier, we plan to finalize the 2022 INA document by the end of 2022. Next slide. So just a few points on the instruction and process for submitting your comments after this webinar. You have 2 weeks from today to submit your comments to staff, so please submit your comments by October 6th. Probably most of you are familiar with this email box, so please send your comments as a single PDF document to irpdatarequest@cpuc.ca.gov. although not required, but we encourage stakeholders to submit to basically include the IRP service list as well, basically to send the comments to the whole IRP service list. And finally, please support your inputs with data and explanations. And if you're referring to specific data, please provide the links or, to those data. So that would help us in our review and evaluation process. With that, we can move on to the specific topics, starting with resource and cost assumptions. And I pass it to Meniao to kick off this section.
Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Can hear you, thanks.
Yeah. Great. Well, hello everyone. My name is Mengyao Yuan, and I'm a consultant at E3. So I've been leading this resource cost update work stream. So before I start, I wanted to give a big thank you to the team. So we have Sam Schreiber and Greg Gengelhoff, and we also received help from various colleagues on this work. So first, I wanted to give you an overview of the resource cost update.
Next slide, please.
And next one, please. Yeah, so first I'd like to give you an overview of the resource cost update. A caveat upfront is that the results that I'm going to show in the next few slides do not include the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act or the IRA. So we have a section right after this one where we'll discuss some of the draft results for the IRA. So next slide shows you a summary of the key updates that we are making to the resource costs. So the first update is that we updated the cost inputs and financing assumptions for most generation technologies, as well as pumped hydro storage. We updated these assumptions to the Nrel 2022 annual technology baseline, or the ATB. These updates were made from the cost inputs that we use from the current result analysis, which was used for the LLC filing requirements earlier this year. So another key update that we made is that we did a review of emerging zero carbon technologies with a plan of incorporating some of these technologies in future modeling. So my colleague, John Stevens, will give a more detailed review of the technology review that we performed. Some updates that are in progress. So we're still working to incorporate the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to present some draft results today, but just know that more updates will be included in the draft inputs and assumptions document. We also plan to update the battery storage costs to the Lazard levelized cost of storage to a later version, which is expected to come out in November. So with these updates in mind, let's take a look at some of the results from this resource cost update. So if you could go to the next slide. So here we're showing the total levelized fixed costs for some of the key technologies that we're modeling in Resolve. So the total levelized fixed costs are the major cost inputs into Resolve, and they will have an impact on the resource build decisions in the model. So you can see here that for most technologies, the total levelized fixed costs are concentrated in that $100 per kilowatt per year range, with offshore wind and geothermal being higher than most of these technologies. And I want to reiterate that these costs are the total levelized fixed costs. We have included additional results on the LCOE, or the levelized cost of energy, as an alternative comparison for these technologies. And these results are included in the appendix. So how do these most recent resource costs compare with what we currently have in Resolve? So if you go to the next slide, here we are showing some changes in the total levelized fixed costs from the current cost inputs into Resolve, which again were used for the LLC filing requirement. So on this chart, the positive values show that the most recent results have increased relative to the inputs used for LLC filing requirements. And negative values show that the most recent results have decreased from the LLC filing requirements. So we can see here that for most technologies, the changes in the total resource costs are pretty small. So they are concentrated in that $10 per kilowatt per year range. Some of the biggest shifts are seen in 3 technologies. So if you click one more time, we'll see some notes. So the 3 technologies are, first is offshore wind, and this is due to the changes in the financing assumptions. And the second technology is geothermal, and this is due to some changes in the fixed O&M costs. The third technology is pumped hydro storage, and this is because we updated the data source from an older Levelized version to Nrel 2022 ATB. So far, the results that I have shown are for the mid scenario or the moderate scenario from the Nrel ATB. So the next slide will show you that additionally, we have low and high cost trajectories available for these technologies. These different cost trajectories could potentially reflect the risks and uncertainties that are associated with the development of these technologies. So on the next slide, we have a note on offshore wind costs. So for a number of analyses up to this point, we have been using this Nrel study that's specifically used for that's specifically done for California offshore wind. We have been using this study as the data source in Resolve for offshore wind costs. So here we provide a comparison between the Nrel California study and the Nrel ATB for offshore wind costs. So we can see that the Nrel ATB cost trajectories or cost decline rates are pretty similar to the Nrel California study for offshore wind. And this is because the latest ATB has adopted the cost reduction methodologies used in the Nrel California offshore study. And this means that there is some alignment in the methodology between the 2 studies. In addition, the Nrel California study was published in 2020, which is still pretty recent. And it also provides California-specific cost and technology assumptions. And based on these reasons, we are recommending that we continue to use the Nrel California offshore wind study for offshore wind costs in Resolve. So moving on, we have another note on the fixed O&M costs for gas generation in Resolve. So currently in Resolve, we have been using Nrel ATB as the data source for the fixed O&M costs for both new and existing gas generators. But what we have found is that the Nrel ATB values tend to be lower than what we have seen in other studies for existing gas fixed O&M costs. So based on this, what we recommend for the next round of modeling is to switch to the CEC report from 2018 as the data source to be used for the fixed O&M costs for existing gas generators. This CEC study was used for the CPUC gas plant retirement study that was published last year. And the costs in the CEC report are also better aligned with what we have seen for ongoing fixed O&M costs for existing gas generators compared to our other analyses. So moving on, I'm going to now discuss some of the draft results that we have looking at the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act or the IRA on resource costs. So the IRA was passed about a month ago, so it's pretty recent, and we're still in the process of understanding the potential impacts of the IRA on resource costs in our modeling. So the results that I'm going to present here today will be draft results that reflect our most recent thinking on this topic, but we certainly welcome feedback and comments from this group. So here are some highlights of the IRA impacts on resource costs. So the IRA extends tax credits for various renewables until the early 2030s at a minimum. Solar energy now has access to the production tax credits, or the PTC. New tax credits are now available for technologies including standalone storage, clean hydrogen, and small modular nuclear reactors. And higher tax credits are also available for technologies such as carbon capture and storage, or CCS. So what would some of the tax credit schedules look like under the IRA? So here on this slide, well, we're showing some examples for the ITC and the PTC. So the ITC being investment tax credit, PTC being production tax credit. So here are some examples for the ITC and PTC schedules under 3 scenarios. So the first one is a pre-IRA scenario. So this is the tax credit schedule before any IRA impacts. We have, in addition to that, we have a base IRA case and also a bonus IRA case, which is shown in the solid black line. So for a project to be able to access the bonus IRA tax credits, it has to meet additional conditions on labor. And our current assumption is that the developers will be incentivized to meet these additional conditions to have access to the bonus IRA tax credits to stay cost competitive. So our current assumption is to use this bonus IRA category as kind of the baseline or the default IRA tax credit. So the timing or the end time for the IRA tax credits also depends on our assumption for when the electricity sector would meet the carbon emissions reduction target per IRA. So our current assumption is that the electric sector would meet the emissions target in 2045. And after that, the tax credits will ramp down gradually. So this is why you're seeing that decrease in the tax credits towards 2050. So with these assumptions, let's now take a look at how these tax credits impact the resource costs. So here we are showing the reduction in the total levelized fixed costs due to IRA for the technologies that we have shown before. So what we are showing here is essentially the bonus IRA costs minus the pre-IRA costs. So one thing that maybe is jumping out to all of you is that there is a lot of cost reduction across the board. And for a lot of the technologies, the cost reduction is concentrated in that $40 to $80 per kilowatt per year range. And specifically for solar, so as I mentioned earlier, solar energy can now choose between the PTC or the ITC. So we have shown both options on this plot as a comparison. So what we have seen here is that for this solar resource, which is at about 30% capacity factor, the PTC option, which is the lighter orange line, would imply deeper cost reductions compared to the ITC option, which is the darker orange line on this chart. So this means that for this solar resource, the PTC option is a better option in terms of cost reductions. And this observation is actually consistent for a wide range of capacity factors for solar that we're considering for California based on our analysis. And we have included some results on this, including additional sensitivities in the appendix. So that actually concludes my section. So I'm going to hand it back to the CPUC. I don't know if you want to do a Q&A or do you want to move to the next?
So let's actually move on to the next section. I just note that, and then if you have time, we go with some verbal Q&A. I just note that there are also a lot of stuff in the appendix. So with more information of these analysis for this section and also for other sections. So for your review and providing your feedback, it would be helpful to go through those as well. To you, John.
Hi, can you all hear me?
We hear you from two screens, so if you can mute one of them.
How about now? Is this good?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. All right, 1 second, just making sure that we're not double broadcasting here. So my name is John Stevens. I'm a consultant at Energy and Environmental Economics, or E3. And I'm going to give a quick review of the emerging zero carbon technology review that we've done. So next slide, please. So at a high level, what is the emerging zero carbon technology assessment report? Well, this was a report that is looking at some of the emerging long duration storage technologies and generation technologies that can provide firm capacity on the grid with either low or zero emissions. And so specifically, the idea is that these technologies in the future may help to maintain low costs, especially during periods in which you have high load and relatively low renewable production. And there's a link to the report that's here in the slide. I'll note just ahead of time, and this is also indicated later, that we are going to be updating some of the costs shown here to reflect the IRA, and the data in the report does not include the IRA. The assessment itself is focused on relatively mature technologies, and the idea being that you need a technology that's relatively mature in order for it to be conceivably deployed in California in the 2030 to 2050 timeframe, which is when we envision, the increases in RPS and the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions really making a technology in this category to be valuable. And so the analysis here was done for various representative technologies, but it's not exhaustive. Obviously, there's many different technologies out there that could be used. This was done for a couple reasons. First was to ensure that we had a reasonable modeling scope during the IRP. And in some cases, we looked at alternative technologies that did not have enough positive attributes relative to either existing technologies, such as lithium-ion batteries, or to some of the other technologies that were included in this review, in order to have them included. Let me go to the next slide, please. So, what did we consider? So the technologies that we looked at were carbon capture with CCS, gas generation with CCS. And so there was a couple different kinds of technology that we looked at. So the first would be combined cycles with either 90 or close to 100% capture rates. So this is post-combustion capture. And then the second technology that we looked at was the Allen cycle, which is basically a system that separates out nitrogen from the inputs and burns oxygen such that your exhaust stream is already concentrated and pressurized carbon dioxide. We then also looked at some zero carbon firm technologies. These included advanced nuclear and enhanced geothermal systems. These are two technologies that are around the clock with no or little direct.
John, your audio is fading in. And
next up, we looked at a number of different storage technologies. So these kind of fall into two groups. The first is zero carbon electrofuels. So this includes hydrogen created from electrolysis using electricity as an input, or synthetic methane, which is derived from both hydrogen as well as carbon dioxide captured from the atmosphere. So basically, in that one, you're combining hydrogen and carbon dioxide to make natural gas. And in both of these cases, you're producing this gas, you're storing it underground, and then you turn it back into electricity in a combustion turbine.
John, Femi, could you, we have some issues with your audio, John.
And then finally, we looked at long duration storage. So we looked at both adiabatic compressed air energy storage technologies, but at higher efficiency, as well as.
John, we can't hear you well, so it's fading in and out.
Okay. Well, let's go to the next slide, and hopefully I'm not too choppy.
John, can you kill your video in case it's a bandwidth problem?
Okay, great. So what are some of the key different parameters that we considered? Well, in this report, you'll see more, but we considered capital costs, fixed and variable operating costs. And these costs have trajectories through 2050. We also characterize other relevant information, such as the existing amount of deployment, limits to the available deployment, different land use constraints, and technology readiness levels. And then finally, we also considered some other aspects, such as what are the planning challenges or policy and planning challenges, including qualitative assessments of things like what are some of the infrastructure needs, what are the different policy considerations, and what are the research and development needs in particular for these technologies. Can we go to the next slide, please? So at a high level, this summarizes some of the information here, and you can see each of these technologies is listed in this table on the right, along with technology readiness levels, a higher number being closer to completely ready, and some estimates of global deployments. And so again, the idea here was to choose technologies that were reasonably mature, in other words, with a technology readiness level as defined by the International Energy Agency as above 5. And we can see that there's a range of different maturities. So in particular, things like iron air batteries are thought to be less mature. Things like hydrogen are closer to maturity. And things like CCS are sort of more in the middle range here. Obviously, this is something that's going to evolve as these technologies are deployed. But generally, we wanted to orient the reader around the fact that some of these technologies are going to probably have more revisions in their cost data as they're deployed, especially if they're farther from technology readiness. And some of them are more mature, and therefore we think we have more certainty in the costs that are in this report. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in the next 2 slides, I'm going to show just some comparisons between the generation and the storage technologies on a levelized fixed cost basis. So again, this is not capital cost. This is an annualized cost per kW. In this plot on the bottom right, you can see that we compare traditional gas combined cycles in the far leftmost column to not only different kinds of gas combined cycles with CCS, but also the alum cycle. And we can see that whenever you're adding CCS, there is an incremental cost associated with that, as would be expected. We've also compared standard geothermal with enhanced geothermal, and you can see that there's a break in the axis, and that under the projections that we've used from the Nrel annual technology baseline, that enhanced geothermal systems are expensive. But again, we recognize that this is an emerging technology and these costs may change. And then finally, there are estimates of nuclear costs, which again are roughly in line with that of standard geothermal. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, great. Sorry, just waiting for it to update. So this is showing a comparison of the different storage technologies. And again, we're following a similar trend where we're comparing lithium-ion batteries, which are the incumbent technology that is broadly used, as well as standard pumped hydro and compressed air energy storage, to some of these emerging technologies. In this plot, we've chosen just some illustrative storage durations. These are not necessarily the durations that will be installed in a resolve model, but the idea is to give you a sense of when installed in a typical system, how do the relative levelized fixed costs compare? And we can see that lithium-ion batteries are much less expensive than a lot of the other technologies, as would make sense. These have already been deployed in, north of 3 gigawatts or so in the CAISO market to date, as well as other markets. You can see that as you go up in duration length, so for instance, compressed air energy storage, pumped air storage, and adiabatic Ks, that these costs are higher. And then as we move up even further in duration, so for things like iron air batteries, hydrogen and synthetic natural gas, or SNG, that the costs continue to rise. You'll also note that in particular for iron air batteries and for adiabatic compressed air energy storage, because these are emerging technologies, we have kept the high bound of these costs constant through the years. There's a slight change just due to financing assumptions as you move to 2050. But that is not necessarily to say that these costs are certain to stay constant, but to reflect the relative uncertainty in these technologies. However, there's also the possibility that those costs fall significantly. Ultimately, I think the point that we would like to drive home here is that as you go up in the duration of storage, generally speaking, the costs, the capital costs of these technologies and the levelized fixed costs increase, and this is to be expected. Okay. And with that, I have concluded our section, and I think we take Q&A now.
Ellie, we have one question from Tom Beach verbally. Should we switch to that very quickly?
Yes, actually, we have a couple of minutes. Maybe we can take a few verbal questions at this point. So if others want to ask questions, please raise your hand. So
Ellie, please unmute Tom.
David, can you unmute him? Let's see. Go ahead.
Tom Beach, you should be unmuted.
You went back to mute.
How about that?
We hear you.
Okay. Can you go back to slide 17? So one question I had is in the second bullet here, there's a reference to recent increase in commodity cost. What does that mean?
This is an attempt, I guess, to summarize the recent increases in various commodity costs that we have observed, and we believe these costs are not properly reflected in the mid-Nrel ETP scenario. But by showing a range of the resource costs or technology costs, our hope is to provide additional options for I guess for us to reflect some of the recent increases in the prices in our modeling.
And by commodities, do you mean like steel and aluminum and fossil fuels? Is that what you mean by commodity?
Yes, that's correct. And I'll also note that the impacts of the cost increases in these commodity costs do not, impact these resources evenly. So there's I guess some work to be done to understand that fully.
And one other follow-up question. When the IRP cost assumptions have been examined in other commission proceedings over the last several years. And, I think one of the criticisms that has emerged in some of those cases is that the IRP resource assumptions tend to rely on a relatively limited set of data sources. And the example I'll use is the reliance almost exclusively on the Lazard report for storage costs. For example, I think Nrel has done a study, sort of a meta study of battery costs using 19 different sources, including Lazard. And so there clearly are a lot of other sources out there. And so I'm wondering what the IRP team has done to look at diversifying and broadening its data sources, especially for critical resources like batteries that the state is relying on. I mean, you've used the Lazard report for a number of years, but as that Nrel study showed, there are other reports out there. And I think the indications are that the Lazard report may be understating battery costs. So could you comment on that?
Sure, we can take a stab. So at the general concept that you're stating there, I would expect one for most reputable producers of these analysis to actually index in a way that captures at least part of the dynamic that you're talking about. But we can look into, and especially if you have particular recommendations on how, look at doing something similar within IRP, which would be extra steps of analysis that we're not typically engaging in. We do tend to trust the producers of these analyses and their vetting processes, et cetera, in our modeling pretty implicitly, but also through vetting that we do right here. So we appreciate the input. If you have particular concerns or ways that you want to see that done, please do put them in your comments. I would also say, regarding Meng Yao's answer to your first question, if you have, say, doubts about commodity cost increases or which ones should be on the list, please do put those in comments and do provide citations where possible. But thanks, Tom. Let's go to Fred Morse.
Go ahead, Fred.
Now, hello?
We can hear you.
There's a technology that E3 continues to ignore. It's concentrating solar thermal power with long duration molten salt storage, even operating for decades in California. It's proven firm dispatchable power. The costs have come down dramatically in the last decade. They're well under 8 cents a kilowatt hour today. The Lazard numbers are wrong compared to reality in the market. There was a study done for the CEC, which hypothesized if there would only be a firm dispatchable clean generation technology with certain capabilities, it could save, you would need less PV and less battery storage. And that technology that was described is CSP with molten salt storage. I think for the interests of California, this modeling has to be improved to include not an emerging technology, but a commercial technology. Thank you.
Fred, thanks for that. 2 responses. First, if you have specifics that you would like to see in inputs and assumptions, please do put them in your comments 2 weeks from now.
I will.
Also, a reminder for folks that we're trying to err on the side of clarifying questions for the Q&A and not assertions. But Fred, we do appreciate the input. Please do follow up written in 2 weeks.
I apologize.
Couple more questions, hands raised if we have time.
I think we might actually ask Chris, Sergio, and Kathleen to put their questions in the Q&A so we can keep on schedule here. Sorry, guys.
So moving on to the next section for SHED-DR and Shift-DR, to you, Mike.
Great, thank you. So my name is Mike Sontag. I'm also at E3, here to talk about shed domain response and shift domain response. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I've got 10 minutes to talk here. Just a quick rundown of what I'll cover. going to talk about some resource definitions. I'll talk about what we've assumed in previous cycles and what we're changing that to in this cycle. We'll look at the shed demand response supply curve. We have some modeling updates for shift demand response and a corresponding supply curve, and then have some brief conclusions. So first, starting with resource definitions, shed or conventional demand response, as we are categorizing it, are loads that can be curtailed to provide capacity reductions. Shift demand response, on the other hand, are loads that can be shifted between hours. How I think about this functionally is that shift demand response are things like pre-cooling a building, or perhaps rescheduling pumping loads. You're moving the same amount of energy during the day, just changing the time that you're doing it. Shed demand response, on the other hand, is more of a behavioral change. You could do this a limited number of times per year. This would be things like changing a thermostat set point to something that's a little bit less comfortable, or having an interruptible load to provide the short capacity reduction. LBNL has been working really hard to create detailed cost curves and load profiles for both of these resources, that we're using that data in this. Go to the next slide. Great, so some background on what we've assumed in the past. Shed demand response has been a candidate resource in the previous 2 code cycles, and it's slated to be a candidate resource in this code cycle as well. Shift demand response is a little different. It was included as a sensitivity case based off of the LBNL phase 2 demand response potential study in the 2017-2018 IRP cycle. That was based on old model functionality. In the 2019-2021 code cycle, we didn't include shift demand response at all. Since that code cycle, E3 and LBNL have collaborated to include modeling updates to better characterize shift demand response and use more granular data from LBNL. And then for this code cycle, it's to be determined to what extent these new capabilities will be used. And then in all cases for data sources, we've been using kind of the latest and greatest from LBNL's DR path model. That generates both technical potential and supply costs, or supply curve for both shed and shift demand response. Go to the next slide. So looking at shed demand response, first, what these charts are showing, this is for a snapshot year of 2030. The x-axis are cost tranches for different levels of resource, and the y-axis is the incremental peak load impact for that cost tranche. So how to read this? If you look at the top left chart, we have about 1,000 megawatts of resource at $25 per kilowatt year. If you were to procure all of that and move to the next cost tranche at $50 per kilowatt year, you would have about 800 megawatts of resource. If you were to procure both of those tranches, you would have about 1,800 megawatts of resource in total. The gold in this is baseline, so existing shed demand response on the system, and blue is remaining potential from the LBNL supply curve. The 2 major changes in this from the previous code cycle, first, are that the amount of baseline shed demand response has decreased. This is consistent with CAISO's loads and resources assessment kind of over time between the timing of the previous code cycle and current. The other change is on the LBNL supply curve. The data has just gotten a lot more granular, and so it changes over time. We have snapshots for 2025, 2030, 2040, and 2050, as well as a few more cost tranches. It can get into more detailed end uses and technology types. It is aggregated up to one resource functionally in Resolve. It's agnostic to how much aggregation or not there is. It doesn't make any meaningful changes if it's more disaggregated in this case. I will note, though, that since we have a separate vehicle grid integration workstream, we removed the light-duty electrical vehicle potential from the LBNL data for shed demand response specifically, and we're putting that in the VGI workstream. Go to the next slide. So talking about our modeling updates for shift demand response, a couple of key things in this. So we put better constraints basically on the availability of when the resource is there. So in the top left corner, an important constraint is just to say for a given end use, how much load is present and how much of that can be shifted into a different hour. So how much headroom do you have to absorb new load in a different hour? We have this adjacency constraint that says that for a given technology, given end use, you can only shift so far away in number of hours. So if it was something like pre-cooling, it would be a shorter shift window. If it was something like pool pumping or pumping in general, it could be a longer shift window throughout the day. We also have constraints for daily mileage and energy neutrality, just to put bounds on how much energy can be shifted in a given day, and make sure that we're accounting for all the energy that we move. And again, they define all these constraints separately by the different end uses and technologies that they include in that. Go to the next slide. Just wanted to give a quick example of how this actually looks and resolves model dispatch. This is based off of data that we used to create the technology initially. It will change. LBNL has updated this data since then. So this is from a previous cycle. This is for HVAC load in a hypothetical 2030 year. We see in the top chart here, load increases in the middle of the day to be coincident with solar generation. And in the bottom chart, we see load decreases, mostly in the evening, but a little bit in the morning as well, to again, shift load down in the mornings and evenings and shift it into the middle of the day to be more coincident with solar generation, decrease ramps, and things like that. If you go to the next slide. So then we have a supply curve for this as well. Again, there is a more disaggregated supply curve available. We have the full list of technologies that are included in that in the appendix, but I just wanted to give a sense of order of magnitude for how big this resource is. It's on a fairly similar size to what the shed resource is. It is worth noting this is incremental to the shed demand response resource. So you could procure both tranches and they would add to each other. You could pick just one, and there's not an interaction between those two. Again, we've removed the light duty electric vehicles potential from this, as we're considering that in the VGI workstream. And in order to have smoother modeling of this in Resolve, we'll need to aggregate this to some extent, kind of to be determined on that as well. And if you go to the next slide, so just summing this all together. So again, shed demand response will be included as a candidate resource based off of your current baseline data and LBNL's shed demand response supply curve. We also have, I think, highly improved functionality and data for shift demand response as well that is available to be included in this IRP analysis. And we invite stakeholder comments on everything we covered here. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Mike. So let's move on to the next section, and after the next two sections, we would have again some time for a few questions. So passing to Suman for VGI.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Suming Wen. I'm a senior consultant at E3. So today I will be talking about the vehicle grid integration analysis. And since this analysis is relatively new to IRP, I will start off with a little bit of background on why we do this analysis and what is vehicle grid integration. So transportation electrification has been a key input to California's integrated resource planning. The ambitious EV goal in California will introduce substantial amount of load growth. So it is essential for the IRP proceeding to consider strategies to manage charging load and also reduce its associated peak impact. And the strategies to better integrate charging needs with the grid needs are what we call vehicle grid integration, also called VGI. So they're usually comprised of two methodologies you can manage charging. The one is like passive VGI, which are usually incentivizing EV charging load shift with the time of use rates. But also on top of that, you can actually still do active VGI, which can be enabled by third-party aggregators to further shift the load beyond the time of use rates. And also within each, you can also either do V1G, which is like just basically shifting load from the peak periods to the off-peak periods, but with unidirectional charging. But you can also do V2G, which is actually allow the vehicles to not only charge, but discharge to the grid. So it's like bidirectional charging. So if we can go to the next slide. So for the goal of this VGI analysis is to try to develop a methodology to first model VGI as a resource in the IRP. And we also want to gather stakeholder feedbacks on a lot of these inputs since they're relatively new, so that we can better validate the size and the timing of the VGI supply curve. And then lastly, we want to use this analysis to determine the value of the passive and active VGI. I want to clarify that this analysis is designed to quantify the value of VGI in the context of system planning, and also to evaluate the impact of VGI on resource portfolio. It is not designed to specifically inform a design of a specific VGI program. If we can go to the next slide. So if we compare what we have been done in the IRP in terms of passive and active VGI, so what has been done is that the passive VGI values are already being estimated and kind of embedded in the IRP analysis right now by using the iProLoad shapes. Since the iProLoad shapes already assume a certain amount of managed charging. And this analysis will continue to use the iProLoad shapes to estimate the VGI, passive VGI value using the latest iProLoad shapes for the 2022 and 2023 PSP. But what is new in the IMA is that this time we will introduce this active VGI resource, and the active VGI value will actually be estimated by modeling them as a dispatchable resources in Resolve. So if you look at the diagram at the bottom and how we are going to estimate the passive and active VGI value, we are basically going to do a set of sensitivity analysis. If you compare the PSP case total system cost, which is the base case in gray, with another sensitivity that is run with the fully unmanaged charging load shapes, you can estimate the safe value from the passive VGI due to the time of use rates. But if we do additional analysis run with the active VGI resources and compare it with the PSP, we can get the incremental active VGI values. And with the passive VGI and active VGI together, we can estimate the full value of the VGI can bring to the system. So if we can go to the next slide. Since for this analysis, we will focus on the active VGI, and for this session, I will also focus on talking about the active VGI methodology. To model active VGI, it is very important to know what is the baseline, which is like the baseline shape that you already assume how many people are already responding to the time of use rates and already doing managed charging without any active management. And on top of that, we will model what you can further achieve to further shift the charging load. So to develop the active VGI methodology, the baseline assumption is very important. And since the IRP has been using the iProLoad shapes as the baseline EV shapes, and also that already assumes a certain amount of managed charging, so it serves perfectly as the baseline for this analysis. But on top of that, we also need to know when people are plugged in and also how much load we can be further shift around beyond the time of use rates. So in order to develop those parameters, E3 will actually use our EV load shape tool to simulate charging behaviors and to mimic the latest iProLoad shapes to generate those like corresponding flexibility parameters to shape the dispatch of VGI resources in Resolve. And Mike already kind of covered a lot of these parameters in the shift and shift DR session. They include daily energy, hourly shift limit, shift window, and we also need inputs for capacity value, which I would talk a little bit more in depth about these parameters in the next slide. In addition to that, we also need to develop VGI supply curve to estimate the cost and the potential of the VGI resource, so we can let Resolve to optimally select and dispatch these resources in Resolve. If we can go to the next slide. So the active VGI resources will be added to this year's analysis will only focus on light-duty vehicles, as light-duty vehicles has the largest amount of load to shift. Medium and heavy-duty vehicles will be included in the future, but since this is the first time we do the analysis, we want to narrow the scope a little bit this time. And also the active VGI resources will be modeled as a statewide aggregated resource with 4 major types, V1 GMB 2G residential and V1 GMB 2G workplace. As I mentioned before, that since the active VGI resource do require flexibility parameters in Resolve, and so we need to develop this inputs to shape the dispatch of the VGI resources. And the first one we need is the shift window, also similar to the adjacency value that Mike mentioned before. It's basically telling the model what is the average window you can shift the vehicle when they're plugged in, and also be able to change its charging behavior. In addition to that, we also need daily energy constraint to tell us how much amount of energy we can shift in a day, and also hourly shift up and shift down potential, so that we can further shift the EV charging load, either increase or decrease compared to of its time of use rate baseline. Due to the limited time, I'm not going to be able to go through all the constraints, but I just want to clarify that all these constraints will be used to shape the dispatch of the resources. But I do have an illustrative example, next slide, that to basically give you a sense of how we are calculating the hourly shift constraints. So if you focus on the chart on the left, so the shaded blue area are showing a population level aggregated average charging shape per vehicle at the residential sector. And you can already see that this is already a pretty well managed charging load shape because it has a relatively low consumption during the peak hours. So for this resource, the amount of shift down potential for every single hour is completely determined by its baseline charging shapes. And so that shaded blue area determines the shift down potential of this Vgi resource. But for the potential to shift up for this resource is actually determined by what's the difference between this vehicle's plug-in charging capacity, or this population average plug-in charging capacity, and the baseline charging load shapes. It's actually not determined by the difference between the nameplate and the baseline shape, because not every vehicle is plugging at every single time. So the amount of shift up potential is determined by plug-in charging capacity. If we look at to the right to focus on V2G, the V2G is actually way more powerful than V1G in terms of shifting, because it can not only fully decrease its underlying base load consumption, but also it can discharge back to the grid up to the point when you reach its plug-in discharging capacity. So V2G has more power to provide power during the peak hours. Therefore, it has way higher value on a per unit basis. If we can go to the next slide. So to also model the Vgi resources, it's very important that we develop the supply curve. This is similar to the solar storage supply curve that you basically determines how much potential you can unlock at what cost. And for this slide, I would just focus on the potential first. So for the Vgi resource, the amount of potential is completely determined by how many LDV vehicles you have in the California region, for example. However, even within all the LDV population, actually not all the drivers can do Vgi, because Vgi usually require the vehicles to plug in a relatively longer time so you can shift the load around. So for this analysis, we assume that only the drivers with access to L2 chargers are eligible to participate in the Vgi program. And based on the demographics data, we estimate that's around 40% of the LDV population. But even within the people with access to L2 chargers, not everyone is willing to participate in active Vgi programs to let people to shift their charging load around. So to develop that willingness to participate in a program, we actually use the LVNL propensity score data based on enrollment data on on an air conditioning program to develop that supply curve. We acknowledge that this is actually not the best data to use because it's based on the air conditioning program data. So this is the place where we sincerely request inputs from stakeholders to provide us better data available from Vgi programs to help us better develop that enrollment data assumptions. But to give you a sense of what data we are looking for, we are basically looking for inputs on at what incentive level, how much enrollment you can achieve. So for example, this example at the bottom is basically showing that at zero cost, you can potentially get 14% of the people to participate in the active Vgi program. And if you give additional $10, you can increase the enrollment by additional 6% and so on. So this is the data we are looking for to develop the V1G potential supply curve. In addition, so we also need to develop V2G potential. V2G potential will actually be estimated as linearly extrapolated as a function of the V1G potential. And we are currently assume that it starts from 0% in 2025 and goes to 50% in 2050. And the reason why we assume it starts at 0% currently is because not vehicles currently in the system is able to discharge back to the grid without being in a pilot program. So we assume that the 2025 timeframe is more likely to be the time when the FERC Order 2222 would be more in place. But this is also an area we also welcome inputs from the stakeholders on the assumption of the V2G timeline and potential, so we can better help us to inform this modeling exercise. If we can go to the next slide. So in addition to potential, we also need costs. So the active VGI cost assumptions we developed for the IRP will only be to reflect the cost potentially paid by utilities to incentivize participation in active VGI programs. Therefore, we will not include any incremental technology costs to enable VGI. And also, we want to clarify that these are not CPUC endorsed or improved incentives. So this is only going to reflect what the modeling assumptions. And the costs that we plan to include are fixed OMN costs. That also includes the administration, marketing, and incentive costs to incentivize participation in active VGI programs. And also we will add variable OMN costs for the V2G resource to reflect the cycling degradation impact on the batteries. If we can go to the last slide, which is focusing on calculating reliability contribution for VGI. Since VGI is actually very similar to a storage resource, it can shift up and shift down, but also is energy limited. VGI will be actually put on a 4-hour storage duration of solar plus storage ELCC surface to account for its interactive effect between grid storage and VGI. And also, VGI is actually not different from storage. It is actually not fully available as a grid scale storage to provide power at its nameplate capacity in every single hour. So a scaling factor will actually need to be developed to normalize the shift down capability relative to its nameplate during the 4-hour evening net peak event. Here also I'm giving like an illustrative example how we calculated that scaling factor. Same chart as before, but if you just focus on the residential V1G, to calculating the residential V1G scaling factor, we basically just use the total amount of shift down potential, which is like the shaded blue area within that 4-hour window, divided by its total nameplate capacity times the 4-hour duration time. So that gives us around like 2% of this scaling factor for residential V1G. But for V2G, because it has much more capability to shift down during the 4-hour window, so the shaded blue and the shaded yellow area added together is around like 9 kilowatt hour. And we will use that total shift down potential and divide it by the nameplate capacity to get its scaling factor. But also because for V2G, it can not only charge but discharge, its nameplate capacity when we modeled it will actually double. So the denominator is like 2 times the 5 kilowatt times 4 hour to give us the total nameplate capability. So the residential V2G scaling factor will be around 20% calculated, much higher than 2% for residential V1G. And then using the scaling factor, we will actually apply that to the VGI nameplate capacity to give us a battery equivalent, 4-hour battery equivalent capacity, so that this capacity will be put on the storage dimension of the solar plus storage ELCC surface, so that we can model it together with the grid scale storage and shed demand response to determine its accurate ELCC value. To summarize the last slide, the requested feedback. So the staff is seeking feedback from stakeholders on the inputs on propensity score data from VGI enrollment, data on the costs and assumptions of the VGI programs and the timing and the scale of VGI, especially for V2G. If stakeholders have data to provide on the statistics on VGI participation and response during the reliability events, we will be happy to take that as well, because though that will not be like a direct input into the analysis for now, but that can give us a good data to benchmark our ELCC value calculated for VGI. And also we are seeking feedback from stakeholders on the methodology to develop those flexibility parameters and the methodology to credit VGI contribution to reliability. A lot of the details are in the appendix, so welcome to review and provide comments. And here I will end my presentation and open up the floor for questions.
Thanks, thanks, Sumin. Let's actually finish the next section and then cover all three sections that we presented. Basically, any questions for resources and cost assumptions. So passing to Femi to cover resource potential and land use constraints.
Thank you, Ali. Good morning, everyone. My name is Femi Sawyer, also a consultant here at E3. I will be walking us through the resource potential and land use constraints section of this presentation. Next slide, please. So this mostly covers what we're going to be discussing today, essentially talking about how we generally characterize resources with locational constraints, followed by the process for actually developing the resource potential for those particular resources, the process of applying the land use constraints, and then how those resources are aggregated and resolved and represented as resolve resources. And then we do go into some discussion about the potential land use screen updates we're looking to do in this cycle of the inputs and assumptions. Next slide. Essentially, resolve has two broad categories of resources. You have the generic and non-locational type of resources, and then you have resources with specific locational constraints. These include primarily renewable resources like solar, wind, geothermal, some hydro resources, and then pumped hydro storage. This presentation particularly focuses on solar, wind, and geothermal resources because those are the resources that are generally constrained by the application of land use screens. Other location constraint technologies will be addressed in the inputs and assumptions draft document specifically. The idea here is that, an understanding of the resource potential based on the application of land use screens is an important part of the CPUC's inputs and assumptions process. Next slide. Broadly speaking, there's 3 steps to creating the resource potential that is eventually fed into the resolve modeling. So you start off with a hypothetical unlimited potential, which is broadly based on physical characteristics. So for instance, with solar, it's based on insolation. For wind speed, it's based on for wind technologies, it's based on wind speed. And then geothermal largely is based off of existing studies on core or earth-based heat. Beyond this, certain thresholds are applied. So for solar, for instance, there's a minimum capacity factor threshold applied. For wind, there's a minimum capacity factor threshold applied. Geothermal has some other considerations beyond just the capacity factor information. And then finally, having gone through this, what we call the techno-economic screens, you then apply additional land use screens, which generally consider environmental, cultural, or legal considerations that apply to the usage of land for certain kinds of technologies. So for instance, you're looking at slope terrain limitations, undevelopable areas due to either private land or sensitive habitats, etc. Next slide. Okay, so this provides a visual example of some of the land use screens that have typically been applied in creating the resolve resource potential. Typically, you start off with applying WEC-wide land use screens, which have considered risk categories for class 3 and class 4. Class 3 representing high risk or environmental or cultural resource sensitivities, and class 4 areas which are presently precluded by law. And so what you end up with is having taken your technical potential for solar or wind resources or geothermal resources, you end up with a more reasonable potential that can then be used in assessing resource selection.
I mean, we can't hear you if you're speaking.
So with Femi's technical difficulties, maybe we can pause that, let him maybe reset. And Ali, should we try to take a couple of verbal questions now, then backtrack?
Yes, let's have a few verbal questions, maybe on Shed DR and Shift DR as well as the VGI. So I see Chris and Paul from before, but I don't know if their questions are about new topics.
Paul Nelson, you're unmuted.
Excuse me, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of the California Large Energy Consumers Association, or CLECA. Just do a quick sound check that people can hear me okay.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to a little press for what CLECA is, because it's going to be pertinent to my question. So CLECA, are large manufacturers in California, industrial customers that manufacture product, and they all participate in shed demand response. So when an event is called, their production process stops. So, products are, there's a financial loss when they make, when they stop producing products. So the question I had, it was just this chart in here. If you could go back to it, I'm not sure what slide number. It was labeled as a DR supply curve. And to me, it looked like it was downward sloping, in that the less you paid, the more demand response you could get. And if you raise the price for demand response, you would get less product, or less response, or less megawatts. And I'm struggling to understand the concept of a downward sloping demand curve, especially amongst industrial or commercial clients, where if you're going to lower the incentive or the compensation for the shed, you're going to get less participation. So I'm really struggling to understand that. I think it may have been the slide prior to this. That's it.
I can handle that question. This chart is a little bit confusing. This shows the incremental amount of load beyond the one you just had. And so this says that you get like diminishing returns in a sense. So you would have already procured a certain amount. It's just that there's a certain clearing price, and perhaps beyond that, the technical potential is maybe to say that like the potential for it is weighted more on the cheaper side of this.
So this is under assumption of trying to do price discrimination to capture producer surplus in this, and that you're assuming that $25 you're going to elicit all comers who take it, and then you'll slowly increment the price to see if you get any additional takers, as opposed to a traditional sort of equilibrium of a supply and demand curve where everyone gets the same price. You're attempting on this graph is to attempt to show the capture of producer surplus, it seems like.
I mean, there's different technologies included in this, so it could it could be different sectors. One sector might be have a lower clearing price, and a different sector would have a higher one, for example. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, this would say that, we have 1,000 megawatts of load that, or a resource that we could procure at $25 per kilowatt year. And then, once we've procured that, if we need more, we would move to the next cost tranche, and it would be more expensive, and there might be a little bit less of it, there might be a little bit more of it, depends, kind of how the cost curve evolves. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because I can tell you right now, at $25 per kilowatt year in 2030, if that's what's going to be offered to industrial customers, and the base interruptible program, I think is, somewhere around 600 or 700 megawatts right now, you'd probably see that disappear at that compensation level. Not saying you've got marked it as 1,000, So I think if you're going to call this if this is what you're going to display it, it needs to get described differently, because it's certainly not a supply curve.
So Paul, whatever direction you have, particularly citable details on how to fix, please do provide in comments, because this is helpful.
I guess I don't understand how, if this is what you're putting into the curve, into the model, the optimization model, that when the price goes up, the total quantity of DR goes down, then I don't understand how that works in terms of the resolve and optimization model. Maybe I'm missing something in how the internal workings of this is being used as the inputs, but.
Yeah, sorry, there's one more clarification on this, Paul. It would be, if you paid a certain price, you would get everything to the left of it. So at $50 per kilowatt year, you would have, in the top left chart, for example, 1,800 megawatts worth of load. You add them together as you go along.
Okay.
Does that help, Paul?
Yes, that helps. But like I said, I think, you might want to edit the description of what this is, because it confused me when I saw it. So.
Duly noted.
Thank you.
Thanks. Ali, I think that's it for verbal questions right now. Should we sound check Femi and try to circle back to the rest of the slides?
Yes. Thanks.
Femi, can you hear us?
We can't hear you, Femi.
So thankfully, we have a pretty deep bench up here. I think our very own Jared.
Can you hear us now?
We can, Femi, yes.
Okay.
Where did you lose us?
Well, we are now hearing you from two sources, so you need to mute one of them.
Where did you lose us, Ali? I didn't quite hear that.
Can you go back a couple of slides?
Nope. Slide 56 is where I think we.
Yeah.
That one.
Okay, great. So essentially, I was saying here that Resolve is a zonal model, and as a because of that, the way we model resources is essentially tied to the transmission zone representation that we have within the model. Generally speaking, we base these transmission zones on the CAISO transmission constraint defined in the TPP, and that went from, in the past, renewable energy zones, or the CAISO transmission renewable energy zones, and now what we're currently using are the actual transmission constraints that CAISO has updated that information to. And then the final stage then is to aggregate the candidate project areas which exist in the Resolve supply curve, which are at a pretty granular level, site level, and then assign them to the specified transmission constraints. So what you end up with is about 8 to 10 solar resources, about 8 to 10 battery resources, and about 15, wind resources spread across the entire CAISO jurisdiction. Next slide, please. And so we currently have in the Resolve model 3 land use screens that could potentially be applied. The Renewable Energy Transmission Initiative, or READY, Category 1, READY Category 2, each of them being slightly more stringent than the other. And then the final screen, which we typically have been using for capacity expansion modeling, is the San Joaquin Valley Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, or popularly called the SJV DRECP screen, which was essentially designed to test the hypothesis that even if the amount of solar resource were narrowed down to include only the very top high priority lands, from a conservation perspective, there would still be enough land to meet the needs of our state policy on renewable energy resources. What we're proposing to do in this INA is actually move from these 3 land use screens to updated land use screens. The CPUC and the CEC staff have collaborated in aligning on the underlying data sets and land use screens that are used for solar, wind, and geothermal resource potentials, both within California as well as outside of California. Outside of California, our consideration is to use the WEC Environmental and Cultural Data Inventory. And in the next slides, I'll talk a little bit about some of the considerations being used for within California. Next slide. Let's move to the next slide. So the CPUC is considering 3 land use screens that involve 3 specific map types. So the first one considers the base exclusion map. The second one considers biodiversity maps, and then the third one considers croplands. And so we're going to be utilizing all 3 of these land screen types and creating land use screens of 3 different combinations depending on which of these maps and the underlying assumptions made on the available land representative in each of these. We would like stakeholders to attend the CEC's workshop to get a lot more detail into the underlying analysis for the creation of each of these maps and the final land use screens and the implications on the impacts on resource potential. Next slide. And so the 3 land use screens we're proposing to use in this inputs and assumptions. The first screen considers statewide information representing biodiversity and croplands. The second screen, which is slightly more stringent, includes biodiversity and cropland, plus statewide information about the distance from protected areas and landscape intactness, essentially considering how much level of disturbance you would have by siting renewable resources in specific areas. And then the final screen includes both the biodiversity and cropland. Could we scroll back up, please? The slide 60. Yes. And then finally also considers statewide information around terrestrial climate resilience, because as we are seeing, we want to understand lands that are relatively buffered from the impacts of climate change and how those will impact resource potential. All of these land use screens are using data that is publicly available. Next slide. Offshore wind resource potential has a slightly different consideration than the rest of land-based wind as well as solar. So far, we have used information that was initially based on the 2019 UC Berkeley study on offshore wind assessment in California. Most recently, Nrel completed a study in spring of this year that, considered an expansion of the potential resource potential within 2 of the call areas that have been considered in California's offshore wind study. As a result, there is a potential for expanding the resource availability from what was originally assumed in the 2019 UC Berkeley study under newer considerations of turbine configuration and arrays to new numbers. And so we're requesting stakeholder feedback on which of these inputs we want to assume, particularly related to the resource potential for the two offshore wind energy areas, which will be up for auction at some point this year. Staff has been working with the CEC to assess the potential for additional sea space as part of the Assembly Bill 525 Offshore Wind Strategic Plan. And with the inputs and assumptions draft document, we will present the full range of resource potential assumptions for offshore wind. Next slide. In addition to the resource potential, another area of consideration when we are creating inputs and assumptions in Resolve associated with resources is annual build-out limits for, in particular, solar resources. This was predicated on the fact that the model was trying to overbuild resources in order to capture the expiring ITC. And this was while the ITC was expiring in 2025. And so we instituted annual build limits of 11 gigawatts by 2025 in the 2021 Preferred System Plan modeling, as well as the 2022 LSE filing requirements analysis from summer of this year. The table on the right presents what those assumptions, top right presents what those assumptions were. And these build limits were, made considering a few different elements. So what the LSE in development and planned resource amounts were, what the CAISO interconnection queue amounts were, and historical annual new resource online dates and the amounts that were considered in each of those years. With the extension of the ITC due to the IRA, which Meng Yao and John Stevens covered earlier, we will likely need to update this approach because there's a longer runway for the expiration of the IRA. It is unlikely that you will see a rush to overbuild resources in the near term. And so we will likely update these annual build limits to now more reflect the feasible annual resource development rather than just primarily limiting the model from overbuilding due to the IRA. Next slide. And then the final element which we consider when we are creating inputs for candidate resources is the first available online year. This has primarily been a constraint on long lead time resources and resources that require a lot of consideration of transmission development, such as out-of-state resources. For the consideration of this INA, because we're also introducing new technologies that are considered emerging technologies, we will also need to introduce the or reach some consensus on the first available year for those resources as well. And so we will also be welcoming stakeholder feedback relative to those particular technologies. The table on the right represents our current assumptions on conventional candidate resources that are modeled in the current capacity expansion analysis. Final slide, please. And so to conclude, we will be updating the solar, wind, and geothermal resource potential with the updated land use screens from the collaboration between the CPUC and the CEC. We welcome stakeholder input on the updated data for resource potential for these technologies, but also in particular for pumped hydro storage resources as well. That is one area that we have struggled to get publicly available information, and so would really welcome stakeholder feedback on our current assumptions. In addition, staff will also introduce emerging technologies in the available candidate resources, and like Nathan has mentioned in his response to one of those questions, exactly how those resources will be modeled for scenarios is yet to be determined. And then finally, staff is also seeking stakeholder feedback on the first available year assumptions for all candidate resources. With that, I will pass it back to you, Ali.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, put in the Q&A. We are basically done with this section 3 of the presentation, resources and cost assumptions. And now we move on to the next section of operating assumptions.
Ali, just one moment. I want to take a second to put a finer point on what Femi just verbalized, that we've been seeing kind of in the Q&A bar. There's maybe a bit of a lack of clarity of where we are in the process. What we're putting in front of you here is supposed to be the start of a conversation that's going to take a couple months about things that we would propose to put into the next inputs and assumptions for use in IRP analysis, particularly its modeling, but is not set in stone. This is all meant to be a conversation with stakeholders for folks to understand, hey, what are the things that we might update, how we might update them, and then, given your input, are we getting those two things right? And even more fundamentally, should we even be trying this? So those are the sorts of things that we'd be hoping for your input on, both for the rest of this webinar and in written comments in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Nathan. And I just add to that, I've tried to explain this in the beginning. Basically, with this webinar, we're front-loading the stakeholders process rather than waiting until we have the draft INA document. We wanted to start this conversation sooner with what we have and what we think our main questions are and what we are seeking in terms of inputs from stakeholders to be able to include those as we draft the INA document. So this is like the start of the process that we seek stakeholders' input and feedback as we develop this INA document together. So let's move on to the next slide at the first section of operating assumptions, and I pass it to Charlie for generation profile creation. Charlie, we can't hear you if you are speaking.
Yeah, thank you.
We are hearing you from different sources now.
Yeah, mute.
You're speaking. If you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Okay, let's try this. Can you? I'm not.
Go on.
Oh, can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. My name is Charlie Duff, and I work and specialize in renewable resource potential as well as the generation profile development here. So we're going to talk a little bit about a few things today. So first off, it's going to talk a little bit about the process for developing those renewable profiles for use in the CPUC IRP and how they connect to what Femi was just talking about with regards to the way in which we characterize the resource potential and kind of create the different regions and resource options and what data sources we use for those underlying resource profiles. We'll also talk about the technology assumptions that go into that, and then some additional considerations. So to dive in, it's on the next slide here. So the way in which we develop the generation profiles from a high level, this kind of shows each individual step, which I'll walk through. The first is starting with what we produce from the land use screen and resource potential characterization piece, which is just covered by Femi. So we start with these shape files that are a result of that the land use screens, and really identify the areas in which we can and will see renewable development. So there are two different shapefiles that result from this, at least for our generation profiles that we're covering today, that will be solar and wind. So after those land use screens and resource potentials are applied, then to create the resource profiles that are produced, we scatter points within those resulting shapefiles in the regions. And so those points for new resources will be kind of dispersed within each of the territories in a more random way. However, for existing resources, those are characterized a little bit differently. We know where the existing solar and wind resources are from EIA datasets and elsewhere. And so those ones we actually use the exact precise locations when we scatter points across all of the different regions when we're characterizing those profiles. So there should be a clear kind of differentiation between the two existing profiles and new profile points. Each of those sets of points are sampled via Nrel's tools. There are two different ones that we'll go into more detail on the next slide, but they are using the National Solar Radiation Database, NSRDB, and then the Wind Toolkit, WTK. Both of those underlying datasets allow you to select and simulate the hourly generation profiles using historical data, weather data, and at all of the different points that we scattered in the previous step. Thereafter, once we have those resulting profiles on an hourly basis over many years that we get from each of those points, we then aggregate those profiles and normalize them to create representative and characteristic profiles for given regions. Those aggregations and the way in which we select those ultimate regions are informed by the transmission constraints as well as the different regions in which we would be considering different resources. That's kind of was covered by FEMI in the previous section. So this is kind of the overall process. Again, start with the shapefiles, scatter points in the regions for existing and new considerations of points, sample via the Nrel tools to get the profiles, and then aggregate and normalize. So we can move on to the next slide. So in this slide, I'm going to be speaking a little bit more about the Nrel resources that we are sampling from. So we create those location-specific profiles for both wind and solar using these two Nrel datasets. The National Solar Radiation Database, NSRDB, uses a spatial, has 4x4 kilometer spatial representation and 30-minute temporal resolution for a large period of time historically. And so this allows us to pick various points of our choosing and get the hourly generation profile for this historical period. The Wind Toolkit, or Wind Integration National Data Set, has individual points, 126,000 points across the whole US, and this has 5-minute temporal resolution. The period that's available for this data set is a little bit smaller than the National Solar Radiation Data Set, 2007 to 2013. But we were able to sample at these various points and get the resulting simulated profiles from them. So ultimately, the value of these two is, it gets us very granular data historically that's that we can then use to simulate the hourly profiles for use in the CPUC IRP model. So next slide, please. So in order to get those simulated profiles, requires a set of input assumptions for each of those different points that I had mentioned from the process in the 2 slides ago. So, so when you think about what the actual resulting hourly profile would be for any given simulated profile, whether it's wind or solar, it would require you to make these assumptions based on the kind of configuration of a hypothetical or actual renewable generation kind of technology at a given location. So for solar here, these inputs would be listed on the right-hand side. Tracking type is one of the core inputs that would affect the hourly profile. So that may be fixed tilt or single axis tracking. And for new and versus existing resources that we characterize, we'll have different assumptions for each. So based on the EIA data set and the existing technologies out there, we do have this data, whether this array would be fixed tilt or single axis tracking, and we incorporate that into our simulations. For new resources, we consider that the state of the art is single axis tracking. And so that is the assumption that we use for developing new profiles for solar resources across the entire new resource data set. For the inverter loading ratio, that's another input that will affect the hourly profile. And for this, we use the state-of-the-art conventional input assumption of 1.3. Some of the other ones you can see listed in the table further below. That includes installed capacity, and that's important for existing resources. That will vary. For potential or candidate new resource assumptions, we create just a kind of a generic, normalized assumption, like a 1 megawatt at all of the different locations that we sample at. The latitude and longitude, those are available from again, as I had mentioned, existing sites or that scatter of random points within our within the set of regions from the land use screen that we use for the new set. Online date, planned retirement date, those are also considered. Forced outage is essentially what the resulting normalized profile would become to. And I'd already mentioned inverter loading ratio and the tracking type or tilt angle as well, and azimuth. So all of these go into each individual point's simulated simulation for that's fed into the Nrel sampling methodology that we use. So from the NSRDB, National Solar Radiation Database, which has all the underlying data, Nrel also has the System Advisory Model, or SAM, and that is the mechanism that is used to actually simulate, which takes all of these different input assumptions that I just mentioned and mashes them up with the weather data that's kind of available from the National Solar Radiation Database, and then produces those ultimately hourly generation profiles. For this data set, we use hourly data and like the weather data that results in a 2007 to 2009 data set. And those hourly profiles, again, are developed by at each individual point and then aggregated up to represent new and candidate resources. So that's kind of the core set of input assumptions that we use for solar. And we have a very similar process and for wind, which I'll go over in the next slide here. So similarly to solar, wind resources, whatever you're assuming, that will have a strong impact on what the hourly profile will be when you simulate them. So turbine type is a very important consideration. Each turbine itself has its own power curve. So based on wind speeds, there'll be a cut-in speed and a cut-out speed, where the wind turbine will be generating either at its different operating levels. So wind turbine type is one of the inputs that we have into the model, which you can see the list of ones that we have on the right-hand side. Another core input is hub height. So based on the height of the turbine itself, that will result in a different access to wind speeds. So that's another core input, as well as the different locations and resulting also for existing generators. Sorry, existing generators, we have also the specific installed capacities that are available from the EIA. So those will also be considered when we sample at each individual location. So again, the temporal resolution that we get for these hourly profiles for wind match that which we have from solar, which is from 2007 to 2009. And again, all of these are ended up getting aggregated up at the end of the day. But this is the kind of process that we use and the core set of input assumptions that we have for developing wind profiles for both existing and new resources. So we can move on to the next slide. So offshore wind resources are treated a little bit differently than our land-based ones that I was discussing previously. These ones are derived from, based on a lot of the input assumptions from Nrel's 2020 study and the offshore wind resource assessment in California. And so these, because this is a newer sort of developing technology, many of the assumptions that we were making here to develop the hourly profiles for offshore wind are considering the state of the art, which is as yet to be commercially available 15 megawatt turbines. So since this study, there are some updates and underlying assumptions that in order to create the generation profile, we're trying to make sure that we're going to be leading the improvements of these hourly profiles. And these updates again are going to be assuming that there's different levels of losses and impacts to the hourly generation, and those should be reflected in resolve. So staff is currently discussing with Nrel how to be consistent between the different data sets that we have for between land-based wind and the offshore wind, because again, we do a slightly different process here in terms of developing the on land-based and offshore wind profiles. And we'll be focused a lot on ensuring that there's a connection between the profiles used in the CPUC resolve model and servo models. So these updates will be presented and and provide a little bit more clarity and the inputs and assumptions draft that will be available later this fall. So move on to the next slide. So in terms of updates and recommendations for what we'll be doing in this next cycle, There's a goal to refresh the new candidate resource generation profiles. And this will, again, since there's going to be a new set of land use screens assumed that will be produced, that will require us to kind of go through the whole process again, where we'll take this new shapefile as resulting from that work, scatter new sets of points and sample at each of them, and then create hourly generation profiles for wind and solar. Another improvement that we hope to do is expand the time horizon of the historical generation data. Currently, the resolution is from 2007 to 2009 for these hourly profiles, and there are additional years available, and we will be able to expand those, which can just improve the overall set of data, because the more data that you have, the better representation you can have of the different resources. There's also, again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, an effort to create consistency between the resolve and serve models. And so calibrating those is always something that is important. And, we want to make sure that they're, to consolidate and have kind of just a connection between the sets of input assumptions and results of each of those. So that will be another update that we'll have in this INA process. So that's all I have in this section here. So yeah, if there's any
Thanks.
Hand back
Thanks,
to
Charlie. Thank you. So we'll have a few little questions at the end of this section for operating assumptions section, but for now, in the interest of time, let's move on to the next section, hybrid paired solar storage modeling, and pass it to Jimmy.
Thanks, Ollie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to quickly walk you through what is basically an ask to stakeholders for what they think is the most important solar and storage configuration to model in IRP of the hybrid or paired variety. So next slide. So I think most of you are probably familiar with the recent rise in the co-location or pairing or hybridization of solar and batteries. I think there's a lot of different terms that folks use, and hopefully in this presentation we can get past some of the terminology issues by just defining all the different attributes of solar storage combinations, and kind of focus on what the resource is doing. But for purposes of this presentation, paired refers to generation and storage resources that share the same interconnection, and hybrid is that plus also using the storage or the solar to charge the storage. And kind of maybe a high level representation of that configuration is shown on the bottom, where there's solar panels. They can either be, the solar energy can either be used to charge the battery, or it can be directed out to the grid simultaneously. And this resource is behind in their interconnection, which then the power has to go through to get to the transmission system. Next slide. So for those of you who've been following IRP for a while, you'll know that Resolve hasn't directly modeled hybrid or paired resources in the past, though it has certainly modeled candidate solar and storage resources, and as kind of a proxy or stand-in for hybrid or paired resources. So the proposal here is to include at least one hybrid or paired resource in Resolve as a candidate resource. It's important to do so because hybrid and paired resources are expected to make up a large fraction of the solar and storage capacity being added in the upcoming years. There can be some differences in the economics and operations of hybrid and paired resources. And there might also be transmission implications of modeling hybrid or paired versus standalone equivalents. I'll also note that there is some representation already of hybrid and paired resources in CERVM production cost modeling. So CERVM is maybe a little bit ahead of Resolve in this regard. Next slide. And to be the bearer of a little bit of bad news, perhaps, The IRP modeling for capacity expansion always requires some level of simplification because we're balancing so many things at the same time. So there's a number of resource types, years, geographic areas, policy goals, et cetera. And so I think what we're hoping to do in this round is to take a reasonable step forward in modeling hybrid and paired resources. And that reasonable step forward would be to try and model the most likely or the most valuable or the best, however stakeholders may define those, configuration of one hybrid or paired resource as kind of a stand-in for the resource class. And this obviously doesn't stop developers and load serving entities from going out and developing other possible combinations of hybrid and paired resources. It's just really to kind of get on the map in terms of modeling this resource class. Next slide. So the next two slides are a list of design parameters that I thought it would be helpful to hear from stakeholders what they think of as the most important or most likely thing to model. And I think we understand that a lot of these design parameters kind of come as a package. In other words, you can't say necessarily what, whether IRP should model DC or AC coupled resources without also saying what inverter loading ratio that resource might have. There's some things that kind of go together. So just to briefly kind of read down the list of things we're looking for feedback on what the best or most important configuration is to model. The duration of the storage, we frequently see 4 hours out there, but sometimes it can be less than that or more than that. How many megawatts of solar there are to each megawatt of storage, whether the solar and storage are AC or DC coupled, the amount of panels relative to the inverter for the solar, and then how big the interconnection itself is, how limiting that will be in terms of getting power out to the grid, how these resources should be represented in CAISO transmission deliverability constraints, in the 3 periods that are modeled: the highest system need, the secondary peak, and the off-peak periods. And then the resource adequacy contribution of those resources. Is it similar, more, or less than equivalent standalone resource? Next slide. Going to more of the dispatch kind of type parameters, should the hybrid or paired resource be co-controlled or independent control? And that's kind of getting to the definition itself of whether it's a hybrid or a paired resource. Should the storage be able to charge from the grid? There could be updates to that in response to the recent passage of the IRA. Should RECs generated from a solar facility, the solar part of a paired facility or hybrid facility, when those are stored and there's storage losses, how do you count those storage losses? Do you count them against the amount of RECs you generate or not? How should the facility be limited in providing operational reserves? And what is basically the cost delta of the hybrid or paired resource relative to its standalone equivalent? Next slide. So in summary, I think what would be helpful to hear from stakeholders, especially those who are kind of deeper in the weeds on how the hybrid paired resource market is evolving, is what is the most important or best configuration that IRP should be modeling. And a configuration here is kind of a set of all those design parameters that I showed in previous slides. So I have some example values here, but these are not meant to be the ones that you recommend. You should recommend your own best values. And then some explanation of why you chose that design parameter so that we can understand how to really choose amongst basically all the different proposals that stakeholders might bring. So that's all I've got. Pass it to the next presenter.
Thank you. Pass it to Femi for transmission constraint implementation.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, thanks, Femi.
Great. Hope it stays that way. Okay, so this section of the presentation is going to cover information that we already walked through a bit during the September proposed PSP workshop, and just go over information that was already covered there, but also give you some insight into some of the updates we've made since that workshop. Next slide, please. Okay, so like I mentioned when I was talking about the resource potential work, Resolve is a zonal model, and we've generally modeled transmission in that nature. In the past, we used the what was called the CREZs, or the renewable energy transmission zones, and this was tied directly to CAISO's representation of the transmission system in its TPP modeling. And the associated transmission deliverability white paper. And so prior to 2021, CAISO represented the deliverability information in that white paper using the renewable transmission zones, using largely technology agnostic information available for full capacity deliverable status resources, as well as energy only resources. Last year, CAISO updated this methodology and the representation of the transmission zones as well, and how resources get tied to their transmission utilization. They went into quite a bit of detail in the workshop they hosted for the transmission white paper, and we talked a bit about that in the PSP workshop. Next slide. And so to give you a quick summary of what those changes were, CAISO updated the on-peak and off-peak transmission capability, and also included a technology-specific as well as location-specific component to that. That created quite a bit of change in how we represent transmission capability within Resolve, and also how we translate that resource representation in Resolve to the CAISO TPP via the busbar mapping analysis. In addition to that, CAISO also updated the transmission representation by moving from the renewable energy transmission zones to actually representing proxies of the physical transmission constraints. And so that information was also updated as well, in addition to updating the available capacity on the transmission system relative to what was in the 2019 CAISO white paper values. So this represented new information on online resources, as well as availability of transmission due to technology-specific considerations like how much utilization solar and wind have in certain locations, as well as consideration of the transmission utilization of battery storage resources. Next slide. As a result of these updates, we made updates to how solar and storage resources are modeled in Resolve. Previously, we did not consider the interactions between storage and transmission constraints. This was largely addressed downstream in the busbar mapping analysis. And so we, with the update to the CAISO transmission deliverability, we then updated Resolve to be able to account for some of the transmission considerations of battery storage, as well as the interactions between solar and battery storage. So similar to, the presentation Jimmy just gave on hybrid and paired resources, we were able to come up with a compromise there on having the same locational or geographic granularity for solar resources, as well as for battery resources, to mimic something equivalent to a paired resource, and while still being able to model the interaction between solar and battery resources, as well as the transmission utilization. And so this led us, down a path where, while we're still not considering full hybrid or full paired resources endogenously within the model, the way we're representing transmission in Resolve and the resource selection approximates that. Next slide. Since we made those updates in the 2021 PSP, as well as the, since we made those updates in 21 PSP and the 2022-23 TPP, CAISO produced some updated information, CAISO made slight updates to the white paper when they released the final version, as well as released the 2021-2022 TPP analysis results, which came with updated information as well. And so we incorporated those updated data pieces into the analysis that we did for the 2022 LSC filing requirements. Largely speaking, those included adjustments to the available capacity for a few transmission constraints, adjustments to some of the resolve resource to transmission constraint mappings that we did. And then finally, we made slight adjustments to the transmission utilization factors for battery storage and out-of-state wind resources. The upcoming 2023-2024 TPP portfolio has, provided the opportunity, or will provide our stakeholders with the opportunity to delve a bit deeper into the specific adjustments that we made and be able to provide feedback in that respect. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Ali.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next section, fuel price updates.
Yeah, hello, this is Mengyao Yuan again. So I'm going to give you a quick update on the fuel prices in Resolve. We first have a quick summary of the updates that we made to fuel prices. So first, we looked into the most recent natural gas price forecasts from the CEC 2021 IPER. And what we found is that these price forecasts are about 0.5 to 1.5 dollars per MMBTU lower than what's currently in Resolve. So what's currently in Resolve, the fuel prices have been used for the LSC filing requirements analysis as well as the PSP in 2021. So this difference is primarily a result of the low commodity prices at the time of the CEC's modeling. So based on this information, we have discussed performing some test model runs to decide whether we want to keep the existing fuel prices in Resolve or updating to the 2021 IPER, potentially using the high price trajectory. So for this update, we did not update the coal and uranium prices because these prices are typically less volatile than natural gas prices. And also with the way that we're modeling coal and nuclear power plants in Resolve, these fuel prices are not expected to have a big impact on the model outcome. So I also wanted to give you some quick background, so next slide, on the natural gas prices in Resolve. So currently, the natural gas price inputs in Resolve are based on the WEC burner tip price estimates from the CEC's NAM gas model runs. So the current gas price inputs in Resolve, which again are used for the PSP and for the LSC filing requirements analysis, are from a CEC model run posted in June in 2020. So the latest NAM gas model run from the CEC was posted in September 2021 as a part of the 2021 IPER. So to give you a sense of how these gas prices compare from these two CEC model runs, so on the next slide, we're comparing so on this slide, we're comparing the gas prices from the two CEC model runs. So on the left, we're focusing on the mid price scenario. So here we're comparing the previous model run, which again was used for the PSP, and this 2021 IPER mid scenario. And this is a comparison for the three regions in Resolve. So you can see that the 2021 IPER mid prices, which are shown in the dotted lines here, are consistently lower than the cost or the natural gas price forecast currently used in Resolve. And on the right, we're comparing the three scenarios from the 2021 IPER, which are the high, mid, and low gas prices with the cost inputs that we use for the PSP. So on this chart here, you can see that the 2021 IPER high scenario sort of converges with the 2021 PSP inputs. This is towards 2030. So based on this comparison here, we will do some test model runs to decide which of these scenarios or trajectories we will be using for future modeling. And that wraps up my update on the fuel prices.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we are a bit behind time. So I asked one question from the you'll raise hand, and Tom, could you put your question in the Q&A, or if you have a time at the end, we can cover that. But we just have time for one question, and we need to move on to the reliability section. So David, could you mute the first person, unmute the first person?
Luke Nickerman.
Luke, go ahead.
Been back on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. This is Luke Nickerman with PG&E. My question is related to the solar and wind profiles, and specifically whether there's been any calibration done with the Nrel profiles to CAISO OASIS data. And the reason I bring this question up is because it's an issue that's come up within resource adequacy reform. And essentially what's the source of the solar and wind data should be for the profiles that are being developed as part of RA reform. And so, we're looking at a couple options, one of which would use CAISO OASIS data. And another suggestion has been to align with the IRP. But as far as we know, there hasn't been a comparison of the kind of IRP profiles with that CAISO OASIS data. So I think doing something like that would be useful in terms of helping us to understand if there are differences and potentially kind of moving towards a point in the future where we're using consistent data sources across RA and IRP.
I respond to that. This is Donald. So for the profiles that we're using for resource adequacy and for the production cost modeling in this proceeding, yes, one step of, you might see a mention here of profiles we're developing for the Servum model. Those are the actual CAISO settlement data is used as part of the regression to help us determine our best fit. So we're using the weather data as well as the production curves, but also actual CAISO settlement data as part of our training data. So I just wanted to let you know that, yeah, we're sensitive to that concern. Thanks. The only concern, of course, is with offshore wind, where we don't have any CAISO production data. We kind of have to do our best with technical sort of engineering curves, but that's that. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but it kind of raised another question. So this CAISO settlement data is being used for Servum, but then Nrel profiles are being used for Resolve. Is that kind of what I'm understanding?
There is an interaction between what's used in Servum and what's used in Resolve. I think there is going to be some effort to update the profiles in Resolve, and we expect there to be some, comparison and work to coordinate between those two. So,
Thanks.
Okay.
I think there's going to be some interaction there.
Okay, thank you.
If there's any other follow-up, we can take it offline. So let's move on to the next section. We have section 5, reliability modeling, Resolve, and Servum, two subsections under this approach and inputs and Resolve reliability updates. we only have around 35 minutes. So Neil, if we can manage to have like 5 to 7 minutes for the first subsection and then around 25 to 30 minutes for the second subsection. Jimmy, to you, Neil.
Got it. Thanks, Ali. And good morning, everyone. Neil Raffin on the IRP team. Yeah, just basically the two main messages here are we're continuing with the reliability approach communicated during the LSC filing requirements work that we've been talking about over the last few months and is currently in progress with LSC's IRPs. And then Jimmy's going to delve into the explanation of what's happening in Resolve to reflect that approach. So on the first slide here, I'm just basically recapping the filing requirement MAG webinars we've held, and I'm referring to both capacity expansion modeling and production cost modeling here, which must work in tandem. Ali's explained the use cases. Just emphasize that in the procurement track, the use cases, we've got the new program development underway, and so those would need reliability standards and resource counting. So that's an upcoming use case for this approach to reliability. And along with that is procurement need determination for reliability in 2025 onwards. Regarding approach here, I apologize with these bullets. These were more anchored in where we were in the filing requirement webinars a few months ago, and I'll just touch on where we're at now in a moment. On the next slide, a familiar one to folks, hopefully, a really good overview, I think, of where we've come from in reliability planning in IRP since the first cycle, 2017-18, through the second cycle where we had the two procurement orders, not directly tied to loss of load probability modeling. And here we are now in the current cycle aiming to improve on that. And then the right table there is really an overview of what Jimmy's going to explain shortly. And then on the next slide, again, familiar from the filing requirements work here. Jimmy's going to explain this, but I will just take the chance to emphasize we are recommending moving to a perfect capacity-based planning reserve margin, a PCAP PRM, from the installed capacity ICAP PRM approach. The rationale is that we're then having all resource types on a level playing field in a sense of reliability, whereby forced outages of firm resources would now be picked up in ELCC studies and estimates for those resources, just like they are already for non-firm resources. So more on that shortly from Jimmy. And I think then I'll just hand to Donald briefly to elaborate a bit on the survey modeling updates he introduced earlier.
Thank you, Neil. So we talked about some big picture server updates earlier. Three big efforts that we went through to kind of do a macro update this time. There's a few that are, I think, a little more minor. In addition to what I said earlier, just to repeat, is we developed we have weather years 1998 and 2020 here. That include new electric demand, wind, solar, and hydroelectric production information and shapes to reflect those weather years. We did a big baseline reconciliation. The first bullet there, I guess, gets at that, added new resources online from CAISO master generating list, as well as new dev resources from the August 1 LSE plans. We moved to the additional transportation electrification case in the CEC's 2021 IPER, and then we did a bunch of other stuff. Like, for one, in the past we've had PGE Bay and PGE Valley split into separate regions, but now they're just one combined PGE region. That's in light of the Energy Commission producing one PGE region forecast now, and just the way a lot of the data is looking. So now we don't I don't want to do anything arbitrary to split those regions. In this right now, for the PSP especially, we did a CAISO co-region where units were explicitly modeled, and then the transfers with the neighbors were modeled as fixed import shapes. We are working on getting back to where we modeled all of WEC with individual units and individual electric demands by balancing authority. That gives us a better reflection of the weather years and weather performance of various regions across weather variability. And so that's going to take some, we're taking a good hard look at that. We updated forced outage rates. We got new GADS data. Recently, the new GADS data came out. We also did some sensitivities around Path 26 transmission limits, relaxed it a little bit for some of our studies just to see what effect that would have. We also updated fixed and tracking solar capacity to align between Resolve and the new master generating capability list inputs to make sure that we got solar generation correctly put in categories. And finally, BTM battery modifier is now treated as a load demand modifier using the 2021 IPER demand or modifier shapes instead of trying to model it as a economic resource in the model. The in front of the meter, like supply side storage, is still modeled as an economic resource. So it's a lot of work we've been doing.
Thanks, all.
And all the inputs, of course, are at that link there at the bottom, which is already also linked right here. Energy Division is using loss load modeling in a variety of commission proceedings. In addition to the IRP, I put a couple of notes here about loss of load and ELCC studies in 2022, or we did those earlier in this year for the R8 proceeding. We're also using a loss of load framework that was earlier in this year also for the avoided cost calculator in the IRP, in the integrated demand energy resource proceeding to establish the avoided cost calculator inputs. We're also using this reliability framework to do loss of load modeling to inform the slice of day framework in the RA proceeding. Sorry, I just caught that typo there. These diverse applications of loss load modeling all rely on the same developed IRP data set, which includes, as you know, electric demand, baseline resources, resource generation profiles for the non-firm resources, fuel prices as discussed. Maintaining consistency and stability in the data sets is critical, so the modeling work kind of translates across various proceedings and you can compare. Of course, data is posted to the PUC website. We have a new 2022 page that shows the updated data sets that we've got right now that are going to be used for this reliability effort this year, as opposed to previous. We also have the previous IRP data sets up there also in case you wanted to see how things changed. The one thing not there yet is the resource baseline list, and that's in final development. We're going to be posting that probably within the next week. Parties can provide feedback to these data inputs and this data set during the regular IRP inputs and assumption development, the INA development, which we do later this year. And I just wanted to make sure and highlight that for those who are following from the RA proceeding, the RA work that we're proposing that we're doing later this year, that third bullet there, that work will also use the consistent data set that we have here. So if you want to participate in that, provide informal comments on those data inputs there, this is a place to do it. So please consult the link that I have there and welcome your informal comments.
Thanks, all. And so yeah, just on process, I just want to conclude by saying on the next slide that regarding reliability, Ali's laid out the general INA informal commenting process, and then staff expects that on top of that, we'll have some process around particularly related to the new procurement program and the reliability content therein, and potential, determining potential procurement needs for 2025 and onwards. Without further ado, I hand to Jimmy Nelson to explore Resolve's reliability updates.
Right. Thanks, Neil. So I'll try and go through this relatively quickly in the interest of time. Neil teed this up well. We have kind of two buckets of updates. Donald, I wonder if you could go on mute. Thanks. Two buckets of updates that we're proposing for Resolve. One is to update Resolve's total reliability need, or equivalently the percentage planning reserve margin percentage held above the 1 and 2 peak, from an installed capacity basis to a perfect capacity basis, and then do a number of tweaks to how we represent the planning reserve margin in Resolve. And then the second bucket of updates is to update all the resource contributions to resource adequacy in Resolve to both, one, be based on SERVM analysis, so loss of load modeling, and also to count all resources at their perfect capacity equivalent, consistent with the change that we did in step 1, changing to a PCAP planning reserve margin. Next slide. So I think many of you may have seen this slide before, but I think it's just useful to note that no resource is a perfect resource, and there are certain resources like perhaps an oil plant or a gas plant with on-site fuel storage capability that might have effective capacity values in the upper 90%, quite a very reliable unit, but no unit is 100% reliable. And there are varying degrees of reliability kind of implied by the shaded colors here for different resource types, and that can vary across systems and years and many different factors. The use-limited resources like storage may or may not have a capacity contribution that's significantly less than 100% of nameplate. Batteries can reach up to close to 100%, but also can be much less than that in certain conditions. And then same is true for variable resources, wind and solar. Those usually have capacity contributions less than nameplate, but the amount less than nameplate at exact percentage is really a function of the system and the resource. Next slide. So one of the main motivations to switching to ICAP accounting, or switching to PCAP or perfect capacity accounting for all resources, is really an acknowledgement of what was shown on the previous slide, which is no resource is providing its nameplate megawatts in really reliability capacity or resource adequacy capacity, and so it seems kind of more fair to count all the resources at their perfect capacity equivalent, or ELCC. I'll use those terms interchangeably here. And one of the motivations for that is, in Resolve, we hold a constant percentage above the 1 and 2 peak, the PRM percentage, and we'd ideally like that percentage across all the years and across all the system configurations to result in a reliable portfolio. So if you put the portfolio back into SERVM, it would show that it was 0.1 loss of load plus or minus a little bit. But that's hard to do with an ICAP planning reserve margin, because as the composition of the system changes and potentially shifts away from the firm resources that would be counted at installed capacity, the planning reserve margin percentage itself would shift, because the higher planning reserve margin in an ICAP world is a result of holding some extra margin above peak to deal with firm resource outages. So you don't have that problem with the perfect capacity equivalent. The planning reserve margin goes down because now the need to hold capacity for forced outages of firm resources is now implemented via the resource contribution itself to the peak. Next slide. This slide has been shown at a previous modeling advisory group, but we performed with Astrope Consulting a number of SERVM simulations to trace out what the PCAP PRM percentage should be. And the number that staff is proposing to use is a 14% PCAP planning reserve margin, with that percentage being measured above the gross peak, not the net peak. In other words, we've moved behind the meter PV over back to the supply side just for the purpose of defining the PCAP PRM. Next slide. So switching to the second section, how to count resources towards that 14% PCAP PRM in Resolve, I think it's important to remember that we have two separate models functioning for two separate purposes here. So a loss of load model simulates many different years and weather conditions and generator outages, and really tries to get at the reliability impacts of the system. And the capacity expansion model focuses more on kind of economics and long-term planning and dispatch of the cost and resource installation impacts of dispatch on the system. So it's unfortunately not feasible to put the loss of load model inside the capacity expansion model and do everything at once. So we need to use loss of load modeling to create inputs for capacity expansion modeling that result in a reliable portfolio as close to one as possible. Next slide. And we've adopted the perfect capacity or the ELCC approach as simulated in SERVM because it takes into account a lot of the different dynamics that we would like to understand. Donald, could you go on mute, please? Thank you. For variable resources, there's the saturation impact where when you install some capacity, an amount of a variable resource, you typically see declining marginal returns because the timing of the peak shifts as you install more of that resource. And then for energy limited resources, they can frequently target the times of greatest need, but then they end up flattening the net load peak, and their energy limitations become more and more binding as more are installed. And then there's a third, even more complicated impact, which is that the combined capacity value of different energy limited and variable resources might not equal if you calculated that capacity contribution independently. So there might be some interactive effects that result in either higher or lower capacity contribution of a combination of resources relative to the individual components. Next slide. So this is a summary slide of all of the Resolve updates that we're proposing that I'll go through in the subsequent slides. So on the left, you have all the different resource classes that we model in Resolve, kind of grouped by resource type. And in the middle, we have how we represented the contribution of those resources to the planning reserve margin in the 2021 preferred system plan. So this is kind of like where we've been. And then on the right column, it's where we're proposing to go. So first switching from ICAP to PCAP PRM, and then I think what we've seen is in a lot of different work and in a lot of different areas, including especially including in California, there's a strong diversity interaction between solar and storage capacity contribution, and so we think it's pretty important to capture that endogenously in the model, and therefore shift to a solar storage ELCC surface, which I'll talk about in a bit, and shift away from the old solar wind ELCC surface, which we've had for quite some time. And batteries used to be represented on kind of a one-dimensional ELCC curve, which their capacity contribution only depended on how many megawatts of batteries were installed. So that's now their capacity contribution will be codependent with the amount of solar on the system. And then we're also proposing to move to 3 separate ELCC curves for in-state, out-of-state, and offshore wind. And then finally, proposal is to update pump storage, hydro, biomass, geothermal, nuclear, and gas plant accounting to be based on ELCCs or perfect capacity equivalence from SERVM. Next slide. This is content that I have presented at the April Modeling Advisory Group, so I'll just briefly say that one of the main goals of ELCC curves and surfaces is to address these challenging saturation impacts and diversity and interactive impacts between different resource types, and do that endogenously in a capacity expansion model. Next slide. So how you build up an ELCC curve or a surface, let's start with a curve, is you have a loss of load model, in this case SERVM, calculate the total portfolio ELCC for, let's say, wind. So you simulate 0 megawatts of wind and 3 gigawatts and 6 gigawatts and 9 gigawatts. So you do a number of different megawatt levels or gigawatt levels of wind. You can then convert those simulations into linear equations, which tell you as you add more wind, how much capacity value do you get? And then you can implement those equations in capacity expansion. Next slide. So same thing that I was just describing on the previous slide, but here in pictures. So the resource nameplate capacity is on the x-axis. You can think of it maybe just as wind capacity, because that's what I'm going to show you on the next slide, but this is just theoretical. And then the curve, the actual curve on the left, is what you might think of as the ideal or kind of infinitesimally small ELCC curve. If you added just a very small amount of wind, you could trace out this curve and find how much capacity there was at any wind megawatt. In practice, you need to limit the number of ELCC runs you do, because the models take a while to run, and it's just, you don't want to do an infinite number of runs. So you run some points that you think can approximate the curve pretty well, and then that's done by Astrape with the SERVM model, and then they pass us at E3 over those wind megawatt numbers and portfolio ELCC numbers, and we kind of draw out curves to come up with an approximation to the true curve on the left. And then we implement those curves in Resolve, and as the model is building out wind resources, it travels along that portfolio ELCC curve, adding capacity contribution as it goes along and adds more wind. But the capacity contribution declines as you add more. So that's the declining marginal that you see in the upper right. Next slide. So we will show a few results of simulations in SERVM that are proposed inputs to the next round of Resolve modeling. So this is the first round of actual results. And these are the proposed wind ELCC curves. We did a number of different runs in SERVM with different combinations of offshore, out-of-state, and in CAISO wind, and kind of compared different ways to represent the capacity contribution of these resources, and landed on the idea that it would be most accurate to model separate curves for offshore, out-of-state, and in CAISO wind. So these are the curves that you see, or these are the resultant curves, and you can see they're relatively linear. They do drop off. You can see the marginal ELCC on the bottom right, which is really just the slope of the top curves. So they have a few little steps in them representing different ELCC simulations, but in general, they're kind of flat and slowly declining on a marginal basis. And maybe unsurprisingly, they're mostly consistent with the annual average capacity factor for these resources, albeit the marginal ELCC is a little bit lower than the annual average capacity factor. Next slide. So now switching to an ELCC surface, which I think is both important to describe, but a little bit complicated. So I think now we've gone over what an ELCC curve is, but an ELCC surface is really just an extension of that into another dimension. So now we have SERVM run quite a number of runs for the different battery and solar penetrations that you might see in the future on the CAISO system. And then you can actually convert those runs at different battery solar combinations into a set of planar equations that are still implementable in a capacity expansion model, linear optimization. And those planar equations have a slope basically in both directions, how much marginal ELCC you get when you add more solar, and also when you add more batteries. So that's what the picture on the right is showing. Next slide. So here's one way to visualize the results of the SERVM simulations that we've done. So again, we explored kind of this design space and maybe even a little further. but to trace out what the marginal and total ELCC of different combinations of solar and storage are, we took Astrape simulations, created a set of planar equations, and then solved those equations as Resolve would solve them to come up with these heat map plots of what the marginal battery ELCC and what the marginal solar ELCC would be at different combinations of battery and solar. So you'll see a couple of things. So first, you want this surface to have some of the dynamics that we know should exist. Namely, if you hold the amount of solar constant and you just add batteries, you should see declining marginal returns. So if you look at that 60 megawatt solar nameplate capacity column, if you go down that column, you see that as you add more batteries, you see declining returns. So that's good. But then you see the impact of diversity if you go the other way. If you start at, say, 20 gigawatts of battery nameplate capacity and you add more solar, you actually see the battery marginal ELCC get pulled up by the solar. And this is for a number of reasons, but largely because the solar can charge the batteries, and also the solar production can delay the battery discharge. And then you see a similar effect on the marginal solar ELCC curve. More batteries can help the solar ELCC and vice versa. Next slide. So I like to see kind of what this looks like in 3 dimensions. I think it helps to visualize it. So this is a picture, which I sometimes call kind of an ELCC surface quilt of all of the different planes or facets of the ELCC surface. So wherever you see the triangles intersecting, that's where an ELCC simulation was done in SurvM, and then the planes that are connecting those points are shown by the different colors. And what Resolve is doing when it is investing in new resources is, it's orienting itself on this curve via the equations that we implement. So it knows how much solar nameplate capacity it has and how much 4-hour storage nameplate capacity it has. And then it gets out the solar and storage portfolio ELCC, which is the z-axis value or the height on this curve. And as it's investing in new resources and building more solar or building more storage, it's kind of marching its way up this curve and potentially going on to different triangular areas, which represent different areas of marginal solar and battery ELCC. So I put 2026 and 2030 as sample values on here. Obviously, that could change if Resolve is building different amounts of solar and storage in different years, but I think it's helpful to just think that I think I took these from the 2021 PSP capacity. So in that run, it was maybe on the green, or it would have been had we implemented this for the 2021 PSP. It would have been on the green triangle, having a certain marginal solar and battery ELCC. And then by 2030, it's built more solar and storage. And so it's gone up to maybe that red triangle, which is a little bit flatter, and incremental additions are getting a little bit less capacity contribution. Next slide. So I'm going to go through a few different resource types. The other types of resources that we're proposing to model at perfect capacity equivalent. So shed demand response, the proposal is to use a constant SurvM calculated ELCC of 96% in all years for the existing or baseline shed demand response. And then for the candidate or the new additions, their demand response and batteries share a lot of similarities. So the proposal is to model candidate shed demand response on the solar storage surface on the storage dimension. But we know that demand response isn't exactly like storage. So we performed Astrape performed a few runs to trace out basically the difference in capacity contribution between a 4-hour battery and a demand response resource across a few different levels of solar and storage. The result of that exercise is on the right, which is a multiplier that we're proposing to implement in Resolve to give shed demand response a bit of a haircut in capacity contribution relative to a battery. One other thing to note here is that this percentage value here is the 4-hour battery equivalent for shed demand response, but then there's an additional D-rate of capacity contribution because the 4-hour battery itself could have less than a 100% ELCC based on the solar storage surface. Next slide. For pump storage, we have a similar proposal to use a constant 95% ELCC for existing pump storage calculated by CERVEM. And then we propose to use the 2022 LFC plan filing requirements, marginal ELCCs for new pump storage additions, which are a little bit less than 95%. And key year for pump storage is 2028, where the long lead time resource at 1 gigawatt NQC order comes into effect. So the ELCC at that point is 86%. Next slide. And I think I saw a question in the chat about long duration storage. And I think this slide is just to say that we hope to work on the capacity contribution of longer duration storage. So, there's certainly a point that we see happening where the 4-hour battery ELCC starts to drop off. It starts to become significantly less than 100%. And, you think that if you added more duration to the battery, that you would potentially be able to prop up that ELCC and have a higher ELCC. That's less true in the near term when a 4-hour battery can receive close to 100% capacity contribution, but probably becomes more true in the long term when those batteries have saturated. So I think that the main message on this slide is we're working on it, but it's also a pretty complicated picture, and there's a number of factors to consider. So I think we'll be looking for stakeholder input and also doing some work ourselves on this topic. Next slide. Hydro ELCC. We performed another CERVEM simulation to measure the total portfolio ELCC of hydro, the combination of both small and large, and that number came out to be 4,970 megawatts and was distributed across large and small hydro based on their capacity weighted NQCs. Next slide. And then the final kind of resource type or resource class or set of resources is the firm resources. So as I mentioned before, we're moving firm resources from being counted at nameplate capacity to being installed at being counted at perfect capacity equivalent. So what the resources I'm talking about are in the bottom left. So all the gas plants and nuclear, biomass, biogas, and geothermal. Strape performed a simulation where they removed all of the firm resources from the resource portfolio, replaced it with perfect capacity, and came up with the total firm portfolio ELCC value. And then that value was allocated across the resource classes using capacity weighted allocation based on the equivalent forced outage rate, or the E4D. And the result is the rightmost column, the ELCC for resolve. They range between the mid 80s and mid 90%. And those values are a little bit lower than the UCAP or unforced outage column, which has typically been kind of thought of as an approximation for the perfect capacity equivalent of firm resources, in part because Strape has noted that frequently loss of load events happen during periods when there are a bunch of simultaneous outages. So that makes it so that the reliability contribution of the firm resources is a little bit lower than their UCAP value. All right, with that, it is 2:59, and I will hand it back to the CPUC.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. There are a few questions for you in the Q&A. So pass it to Nathan for next steps and closing remarks.
Thanks for that, Ali. I think we can go to the next slide, which is largely logistics based. But before diving into the next slide, do want to remind everyone of the potential use cases for the information that we just covered. So Ali stated in one of the intro slides that a couple of the obvious use cases are potential uses in development of the 2023 preferred system plan that we have coming next year, potential development of portfolios for the 2024-2025 TPP. But there are other potential analyses within IRP and outside of it that could be consuming this information. You've noted some participation from stakeholders that are more in the IDER and behind the meter PV areas, so to speak. And that is because some of our information is basically upstream of things that eventually affect them, and things like the avoided cost calculator. We also have information here that will be used in all likelihood in upcoming studies for the resource adequacy area that Donald, I think, highlighted when he was speaking a few sections ago. Logistically, we just want to cover some basics. So the slides will hopefully be up soon that we just covered.
It's up.
That's great. So while we were covering the slides these last 3 hours, they did get posted to the website. So feel free to go there and download at your convenience. Not too long from now, we'll pull down the recording and the Q&A transcript and post them on the same part of the site. One of the key things that happens from here is your comments. So some instructions. You guys are invited as stakeholders to submit informal comments by October 6th. Please use the IRP data request email that's listed right here. And feel free to include the IRP service list if you so desire, because we know that sometimes folks want to kind of broadcast the information broadly so that everyone can understand positions and the best information that folks know of in the area that they're commenting on. Please, and this isn't just a favor to us, but will actually help your comments get digested and used better. Please categorize your comments based on the sections of this webinar. When you go back to slide 5, the agenda slide, you'll note numbers associated with each of the topic areas that we just covered. If you could please organize your comments according to that system, that would be very helpful in our consumption of your information and making use of it. If providing recommendations, please support with data wherever possible, and including citations if you can. Just saying that you disagree with a certain position or a certain proposal is only partially helpful. We really need you to focus on trying to provide actionable solutions in your comments too. Once we get all that information in early October, we're going to incorporate the relevant input into the next version of our INA document. We expect to release that next version in November and then have another webinar, so another one of these. We would then plan on having another round of informal comments after that to help us sharpen things for a second time. And we'd incorporate that input and hopefully can finalize the new inputs and assumptions document before the new year. I think that might be enough on process for now. So just a couple quick closing remarks. Just general thank you to everyone for your participation. So that's not just the speakers and the other contributors that were helping with the Q&A, but to stakeholders for spending the last 3 hours with us and your engagement, especially those who are asking questions and channeling their energy into helping us sharpen right now. I'm seeing about 120 slides that we just covered and 90 plus questions if you include the verbal ones. So thank you everyone for your engagement. All of your input is going to help us turn this into the best set of inputs and assumptions that we think possible for use in this cycle. So thank you in advance. I think with that, we'll just say cheers, everyone, and we look forward to hearing from you in October. David, feel free to stop the recording.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I know it's annoying.